So, Jeff, it's finally happened. EcoHealth and Peter Daszak have been debarred from receiving US government funding. And of course, this all comes 4 years too late. In fact, it probably comes 10 years too late. So, I guess we should really today go through the timeline here of well, it's 2024. He's got debarred now, and why this should have happened a long, long time ago. And again, we're not talking about when COVID arrived. We're talking much, much earlier because the warning signs were there over and over and over again. So I think it'd be a good idea just to recap the entire timeline to do with EcoHealth, just to illustrate why this is all way, way too late. Not that I'm not happy that it happened, obviously, but it's just too late.
Yeah, I guess though before we go there, I'd sort of note, in a way, this is the second defunding of Daszak. Daszak had his first private interview with the House committee. They came out of that, and everybody voted to defund him. And through the Defense Committee, a little subcommittee later, they were refunded. Now, they didn't institute the funding specifically for WIV, for the work there, but everywhere else, and it was immediately reinstated.
Yeah.
Why is that? And will this defunding actually stick? It kind of feels like this time it will, that after that disastrous hearing of his, we talked about that in a prior episode where first half he was pretty arrogant and kind of holding his own. And then the staff members for the committee came in, started asking some real questions that should have been asked, well, eons ago, but certainly at the outset of that committee. And, the whole tenor of everything changed. And it became very apparent to, just to people who weren't familiar with Daszak, how much he was lying, where you had kind of a unified buildup in Congress of both Dems and Republicans. So it became kind of a bipartisan dislike and distrust of Daszak. So it
Yeah.
probably sticks this time, but it's worth noting that they did this before and the funding came back.
Yeah, that's right. But I agree with you. This time it's going to stick. And
Yeah.
this time it's throwing him under the bus. I mean, that's another aspect here that
Yes.
we should probably mention at the outset that this is not Congress. This is not GOP controlled House or whatever. This is Joe Biden's Department of Health and Human Services. They issued this order, and the suspension is immediate. There is a process, but the suspension is immediate. These guys are done. So again, this is from the Biden camp, and this would not happen unless it's been decided that this is going to be the fall guy. Now, everyone knows COVID came out of a lab. I mean, that cat is out of the bag now. So obviously, the cover up has moved to a new sort of phase, and then the new phase appears to be that Daszak is going to be the fall guy.
Well, it's kind of funny too, because I think the both of us we've talked about this before, but sort of felt like everybody in the world knew this was the ultimate direction that we were heading in. That they were going to, at some point, there has to be a fall guy for this. The information's coming out. We knew pretty much all of this, years ago. If we could do it, so could others. So then it becomes only a matter of time. They can only suppress the information for so long. So it's inevitable that that information is going to come out. Therefore, it's inevitable that there's going to be a fall guy. Daszak's been kind of the face of this in many respects in terms of doing the actual work or being part of that and just lying constantly. So it was always kind of obvious that Daszak was going to get fingered. I still think, Fauci's probably going to have his comeuppance as well. We'll see if that holds true. But obviously way too late. I mean, if I was Fauci right now, well, and Daszak, I'd probably be pretty nervous. And I almost mean that from a personal safety vantage point. There's so much at stake here. I just,
There's a
I'd be concerned.
Also, as Fauci, I agree. I mean, there were a few emails along the way that Daszak sent to Fauci's office and others, but within the sort of the cover-up circle. This is in 2020, and he strongly hints that it would be very bad if the certain information came out, because it wouldn't only look bad on him and EcoHealth, but it would also look very, very bad on Fauci. And we should sort of all work to make sure that does not happen. Okay, so was he bluffing, or does he sit on real bombshells? Now, he is a grifter like I've never seen. I mean, just an absolute top level grifter. The amount of money he's been able to, I mean, he raked in like 120 million over the course of like the past 10 whatever plus years. Huge salary, for himself, of course. We already talked about the first class flights on previous episodes and so on.
Yep, jet
He
setting
thought he had it
lifestyle.
all, and
Right.
now it's gone, and he's going to be pissed. And now the question is, were these threats empty threats, or does he actually have something? And I would, if I had to bet, I'd say he does have something. He doesn't have like the holy grail in terms of blackmail material, but I think he would have laid some traps along the way, where he would have sent David Morans, who's Fauci's assistant, who apparently was a very good friend of Daszak's, but Daszak is going to throw them under the buses. I mean, he's going to do the backwards throwing under the bus to these people to kind of make up for what they did to him. And there's probably going to be emails to Morans or people like that where he kind of says a bit more than he would have ever said in public. And maybe those emails will now leak. Remember a few weeks ago, Daszak already released some emails that really looked very, very bad on Fauci's group, NIAID. And I always felt that was sort of, don't throw me under the bus. Well, now it's happened. He's gone. No more funding. So, and debarment. I mean, this is not just like, oh, well, we're not going to do any more grants for EcoHealth, but you're all good still. No, this is the whole 9 yards. This group is shady. This group should never, ever be funded by the U.S. government ever again. They're banned from being funded by the U.S. government. These people are done. That means they can't go anywhere else either. I mean, they're just done. So, what do you think? Was he bluffing, or is there something there?
I would guess he's not bluffing just based on his long history with Fauci, and all the grants. I mean, remember going back, there was that whole sequence when we were trying to figure this out. And there was the sequence of emails in regards to the pause in funding. And Daszak mysteriously somehow gets a complete carve out for gain of function funding. When that pause was initiated and any funding for gain of function work was stopped, and Daszak was complaining about it in emails to NIH and going back and forth and asking, he needs to get this reinstated, and he did get it reinstated. There was always like a special treatment for him under the radar. So I'd be staggered if he doesn't have what he needs to have on everybody, which is why I said kind of at the outset that if I was Fauci, I'd be nervous right now. Because, Daszak's going under the bus, but I got to think Fauci's probably going to go under the bus too. My question would be the larger issue of, we know there's all the connections to the intelligence community, the DOD, the funding. We've always, known that there's a larger premise lurking behind this. What exactly that is, we don't have fully answered yet. We know there was all the federal agencies that were part of the diffuse funding. So there's a much larger circle of vested interests in this whole thing that don't want information to come to light. So to me, the question is not, does he have the ability to throw Fauci under the bus, but who else can he throw under the bus, and will they allow that to happen?
Right, I agree, but I think he's not a very strategic person. He seems to be more of he's just a grifter. He's very, very good at that. Strategic person, what I mean by that is, as you say, there are so many interest groups involved. There's so many power bases involved. As you say, it's not just NIAID. It's the Pentagon. It's the intelligence services. It's you can play off other parties. You can try and I don't think he'll be able to re-ingratiate himself with the Democrats, but he can play off people within NIAID. He can try and get STEMI on his side. We'll get back here to STEMI in a moment. Remind me if we don't. I think we need to talk about him. But anyway, there's so many permutations. I just don't have him down as a particularly kind of strategic person who's now going to kind of figure out what to do. I have him down more as a lashing out person, which is what he did a few weeks ago when he released those Morans emails. Supposedly for context, but it had nothing to do with any context about anything. Remember, he said, the New York Post published a story, and for context, I'm going to release these emails. But the emails had nothing to do with the New York Post story. The New York Post story was about the fact that David Morans, who's Fauci's assistant, had used Gmail to avoid freedom of information laws. Well, that got nothing to do with Daszak, right? So Daszak released these emails about Morans, which made Morans not only look very, very bad, it made Morans complicit in the in creating COVID, or at least creating COVID-like viruses over in Wuhan, and then that there was this constant covering up of all these things, and so as we said, there's probably more of these emails. That was sort of the shot across the bow. Didn't work. Now he got slapped in the face. he got defunded. So again, is he now going to sit down and work this out as a strategic, game it out in a strategic way? And I don't think so. I think he's just going to lash out, and it's going to be fun.
I think that's probably correct. Think back to when he had the second, third, fourth, fifth rounds years, but each year was a new round of funding for his projects in WIV, and how he was going back and forth and how he delayed. He hadn't sent what he was required to NIH. And as NIH underwent sort of this leadership change and things were becoming public, and they had to do something, and they were going back and forth in these letters to Daszak, and Daszak was being not only just evasive but also arrogant and lashing out a little bit, as you said. I think that was maybe a bit of a preview for the kind of behavior that we can see as this thing unfolds.
He always got away with everything, so he never needed to be strategic.
He was always accustomed, right?
He got away with the gain of function. Oh yeah, okay, you can get your money back. He got away when Trump took away the money. He got his money back. Look at the Lancet letter. That fraudulent letter that he issued in February of 2020 said, "Oh, it's all natural, and anyone who says otherwise is a horrible conspiracy theorist." Remember, initially in some of these private emails, we were saying he wrote it, he initiated it. Fauci initiated it, but he wrote it and he pushed it and he got it into Lancet. He did all those things. That was all Daszak. Remember one of the early emails, he said, "Okay, I'm going to do everything, but I can't have my name on it. Let's have other people's names on it." And then like a day later, he turns around and puts his name on it anyway. That to me is not strategic thinking. That's just a guy who always got away with it because he was, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, he had protection, and that's gone now. And so it's going to be very interesting going forward.
Well, and he's also a guy that always operated kind of on a sleazy basis. I mean, as part of that whole stream, he was trying to convene a bunch of scientists to agree with him. And that was happening as part of their meeting with NASM in the very, very early days. The day after the Fauci secret teleconference, they're out there meeting with NASM, the National Academy of Sciences, Medicines, et cetera, which is in turn responsive to the Trump White House to try and give them some early thoughts on the origin of COVID. And Daszak's operating behind the scenes the entire time, trying to manipulate the outcome of the opinion at NASM, trying to get buy-in. You can tell in these emails, he thinks he's going to have them go along with their push for the natural origin. And NASM actually didn't do that. And that threw a wrench in Daszak's plans. He had to delay his letter. You could see him kind of maneuvering with scientists. And for all his attempts to bring in these other scientists, at the end of the day, he ended up bringing in a bunch of EcoHealth people and hiding their identities to make it look like they weren't affiliated with EcoHealth. So, and I think on every aspect that we've ever seen Daszak operate, it's always scummy, it's always sleazy, it's always, got some angle, some motive, but as you said, not particularly well thought out. And, in terms of kind of what he might do, remember his very early email, I think it was December 2019, at the very outbreak of COVID, and he sends Fauci what are like some talking points. There's really two emails, if I remember correctly. The first was sort of an admission, a quiet admission that they'd been doing gain-of-function research, followed very quickly by another email that went more or less opposite to that, directed to Fauci and gave him talking points that he could use. But if you read that letter kind of behind the scenes, it's both a warning of what he's letting him know that COVID actually, that it probably came from them, and he's giving him talking points to use, and there's sort of an implicit warning to Fauci. So It's kind of an every aspect that we've seen him operate. That's how he does it.
And of course, the Twitter thread, December 31st, 2019, before anyone had ever heard anything, he suddenly issues a Twitter thread about why this new virus is 100% natural. Where did that come from? And the timing as well. So of course he was doing CYA, extremely early CYA. But again, it's so sleazy, so clumsy, so not well thought through and so on. Because as we said, he never had to. He was never operating in any high level environment because everyone just had his back. And so I expect that to continue, and it will be messy, and I really look forward to it. And I just can't wait for him to dump some emails on Fauci or Morans or whatever. But I think we should just go back here in terms of the timeline that we mentioned earlier, and STEMI that I mentioned earlier as well, because I think what is overlooked in this whole saga, and of course, a lot of people are now, yay, they finally got defunded. Okay, all's and well, that ends well, and so on. Well, no, not really, because I think what's overlooked is that the writing has been on the wall for years and years and years, way before COVID. The warnings were all there. And this is such a frustrating aspect of it all, where you didn't only have one warning or two warnings or three warnings, you had them over and over and over again, and nothing ever happened. And of course, that at that point, it's no longer just Daszak or just EcoHealth. It's all the other people who ignored the warnings, or who in the case of Fauci, not only ignored the warnings, he was deliberately flouting the warnings. So I guess we got to start in 2011. Fauci funds this experiment that makes H5N1, the virus, airborne, and therefore far, far, far more dangerous for humans. And he's so proud of it, and he celebrates it and whatever. But luckily, there are some people back then who say, well, this is not good. You're celebrating because you're manipulating these viruses, creating super viruses, but have you actually thought it through? And then he issued that extremely I don't know what's the right word here, Jeff. I mean, the op-ed in the Washington Post.
Yeah, it was. You're talking about that a flu risk worth taking. Is that the one that you're referring to?
The 2011 one. Him and Francis Collins, his boss. So they issued that op-ed. I mean, I'm just looking for the right word here. It's sort of, it's almost surreal. Thinking back, surreal might not be the perfect word here, but that's kind of what I'm getting at here. The guy is warned, don't do this. These experiments are very bad. Creating supervisors is very bad. And he has the gall to go out in the Washington Post, issue this full page thing, a flu risk worth taking. Let's do it. Let's create these viruses. 2011. And then he lost because Obama, got to give him credit sometimes, right? If you get something right, you got to give him credit. Or someone within the Obama administration said, no, it's not a risk worth taking. And they banned it. They banned these experiments. And then, of course, this was in 2014. So, okay, it took a while. This is not great, but okay. And then what happens in 2014 when it's banned? Fauci gets Daszak, and this is where Daszak comes on the scene. So 10 years ago, again, all before COVID, and all the warnings were there. And he gets Daszak to do this stuff over in China, in a hostile country, in a CCP-connected lab. I mean, it's just unreal. Just so possessed by this idea of we got to create super viruses that it either didn't occur to him that it's not a good idea giving all the technology and everything to China and doing it over there, or he just didn't care, or maybe he just did it on purpose. I don't even know.
Yeah, and there's always been this pretense that lab accidents are exceedingly rare. And, Fauci even was, talking about that in his paper. And I was just looking at the quotes from that. And, he says something to the effect of, researchers have created a laboratory virus that does not exist in nature, but important information and insights can come from generating a potentially dangerous virus in a lab. And yet, we talked in a previous show about the Ebola outbreak and how, at least speaking for myself, I'm virtually positive that that leaked out of the Kanema lab. There's questions around how the Zika virus came into being. There's very real questions as to how Lyme disease came into being. And, these guys are operating as if they're gods, and almost in a sociopathic, psychopathic way, I don't know what the right word is, but just not caring about what happens or what the potential ramifications could be. There's almost a certain zeal on the part of Fauci, like his whole pursuit of the mRNA vaccine and the use of that. It's just so disturbing that they would continue to do this. And that was Daszak's history, right? Is once the pause on gain of function was enacted by some cooler minds, probably one of the few good things that Obama actually did. And then the whole thing was an operation as to how Daszak could get by that.
Right. So Fauci gets Daszak to take all this stuff over to the Wuhan lab. This is 2014. That is then the starting gun, the sort of the kickoff of another collaboration which was basically catalyzed and made possible by Fauci and Daszak. And that collaboration, of course, is between the director of the Wuhan lab, Shijing Li, and Ralph Baric, the godfather of gain of function. Because those guys were not doing things together. But once Fauci outsourced this stuff to a hostile lab, he empowered the hostile lab and basically endorsed the hostile lab. I mean, he gave a hostile lab NIAID status. I mean, this is a highly prestigious status to have, 2014, right? Through Daszak. All of a sudden, Ralph Baric over at the University of North Carolina, the godfather of gain of function, the world's foremost coronavirus expert, the guy who's been manipulating viruses the longest, who created a technique to do it in a way that leaves no traces. The guy, whatever the accolade you're looking for in terms of these virus creation things, that's your guy, Ralph Baric. So suddenly Ralph Baric goes, oh, okay, well, now I guess the Wuhan lab is okay because it's Fauci endorsed, it's NIAID endorsed. So he starts collaborating with these guys. And then in 2015, they put out this paper where they manipulated viruses. Shijing Li, Wuhan lab, and Ralph Baric. And of course, who paid for that study? Fauci did. And how did he do it? Or who else who was the conduit for the funding, which is never talked about? EcoHealth, Peter Daszak. So this sort of deadly combination of Daszak, Shijing Li, and Ralph Baric started in 2014. And in 2015, that paper came out. Immediately, this is, again, totally overlooked. People like Richard Ebright and a couple of others were out there at the time, not like 5 years later, like right at the time in 2015, saying, you can't do this, don't do this. Ebright said, this is going to create a pandemic. That's literally what he said. Yeah. Creating these coronaviruses in a lab, Baric, Shijing Li. And that is 5 years later, exactly what happened. And this is all Fauci's baby in terms of the brain behind it, the sort of the godfather behind it. Daszak is the conduit who makes it happen, and then you have the actual scientists, Shijing Li and Ralph Baric. I think when people look back on this timeline that we just kind of briefly went through, in 100 years' time, after we're all dead and after all the sort of the details are lost, I think hopefully what will be there, what people will just be absolutely flabbergasted by, is how did this happen? That's just impossible. It's more than reckless. It's just completely. You had so many warnings, and you kept pushing, and you kept doing.
I was actually just looking at the timeline that we did early on in all of this when we first started really exposing. And so you've got July 24th, 2013, the RATG13 virus, which was the very close virus to COVID. That's the one that Shijing Li later concealed and tried to pretend she wasn't working on. That was when it was discovered by her team. So July 24th, 2013. It's at that same time that James LeDuc, the Galveston Fauci-funded CDC lab, starts training the Wuhan Institute workers. Now, shortly after that, October of 2013, Daszak claims that they've done the first successful isolation of Elias coronavirus at the Wuhan Institute. You have the sequence of events ongoing. Daszak got a big $3.7 million grant from Fauci in the middle of 2014. Then in October 2014, that's when Obama puts the moratorium on things, and then everything fully shifts over to the Wuhan lab. The physical construction of it was complete in 2015, early 2015, and then that's the same period at which that work now starts, and the gain of function, experiments start to take place, and that's when Baric starts getting involved over there. So when you look at it like that, and you're literally walking through the dates, it's very easy to see what happened. They were building up to something. We can't do anything more. A pause gets enacted domestically, and they just very quietly and subtly shifted over to here. Also worth noting that Baric went to great lengths to downplay the fact that he wasn't really involved with Shijing Li. She was just a periphery who, maybe called him on the phone once. And they issued the paper. This is something you brought up to me offline. But, maybe you can introduce this. But the idea of the fact, they didn't even list Daszak as being involved with that. They had to amend that, a month or two later. So there's always this great idea to kind of underplay everything and move it overseas and be very quiet about it. But it was strategic.
Very much so.
Or
I mean,
responsive, maybe is a better way to say.
right. I mean, Barrick went over there. I mean, there's photos of him at the Wuhan lab. I mean, so this idea that,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know who this lady is, or hardly ever spoke to her or whatever. Um, yeah, this is all. I mean, it's like the cover up was already in motion before COVID ever came up, because these guys knew that what they're doing is well, it circumvents the Obama ban on gain of function. And this gets us into 2016. So 2015, there's that paper where they manipulate these viruses and make them more infectious in humans, the first step to COVID. Again, involving not only Xi Jinping and Barrick, that's the part that's been reported by whoever talks about these things, but as you said, Daszak was an integral part of that. He was the conduit, he was the funding part of it. And that part never ever gets talked about, because it's those three who then later, we'll get here in a moment, come up and diffuse again. The same three guys, the same three people. And you're right. The paper initially didn't mention anything about Daszak, and then they corrected it. To be fair, they corrected it before COVID, so it was not a COVID correction. But okay, so then we move into 2016, and then we get to STEMI. So I said we get back to him, and we're back with him. So there's a guy called Eric STEMI. He's a program officer over at NIAID, which is Fauci's organization. And I have no idea who this guy is in terms of what he looks like or anything like that. But I've seen all his emails, and I've seen his letters and things like that, which were released through FOIA kind of over the years. So he appears to be, or appears to have been, back in 2016, just kind of your dour Washington, D.C. bureaucrat who just goes through the papers and whatever. So he gets the Daszak report from the project over at the Wuhan lab, where Fauci outsourced the gain of function. And as a lowly program officer in Fauci's office, he's like, whoa, oh my God, these guys are doing gain of function.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it is in Wuhan, it's still funded by U.S. taxpayers. So it's still no good. In a way that the circumvention wasn't really a circumvention at all. You're not allowed to do it anyway, because it's the same thing. U.S. taxpayers still paying for it. So STEMI immediately put a hold on it. This is 2016. Again, another shot across the bow, another huge warning. STEMI, no, you can't do this. You got to stop it immediately.
Right.
And this is, I think you alluded to this a few minutes ago, out of nowhere. And we still don't have the paper trail, because there isn't a paper trail, because it was just Fauci who, put his foot down. Out of absolutely nowhere, the suspension of the money to EcoHealth for these gain of function experiments, 2016, the suspension was lifted just out of nowhere.
The other thing that's always struck me that it's just another note. Obama issued a whole bunch of executive orders right at the very, very end of his administration. One of them changed the whole succession hierarchy for the DOJ. But another one that doesn't get any attention is he issued this last-minute policy guidance on January 9th, 2017, that lifted the moratorium on gain-of-function funding and work.
But let's be fair. I always thought that was basically Fauci manipulating people behind the scenes and making use of this transition period. The Obama people aren't really paying attention anymore. The Trump people aren't paying attention yet. And the timing is just too suspicious for it not to have been put in motion by Fauci in some way. I know the Obama people had to issue the letter, but I can't believe that just coincidentally happened on January 9th, 2017.
Well, I'm in no way am I saying that it was coincidental, but I'm a lot less generous in terms of Obama's complicity. It was him that put the moratorium, and then he's signing the document that lifts the moratorium and allows for it moving into the Trump administration. So, yes, I'm sure it was Fauci manipulated, but personally, I believe that Obama was absolutely 100% perfectly aware of that, because it's diametrically opposed to something that he issued. So,
and we all remember, right, at the beginning of Trump, Fauci goes on TV and says, oh, Trump will face a major pandemic. Remember that?
Yep.
Now, look,
there's a lot of things that when you go back and you look at the predictive aspect, they're very, very questionable or strange or odd.
They are. I mean, I'm not as... I still think that the whole COVID thing was an accident on the Chinese side, but it is certainly very, very strange. Now, in terms of another thing that Fauci did during this period, again, looking at the timeline, which ties in at least at a minimum with the idea that he knew exactly how extraordinarily reckless and dangerous it was, what he was doing over at the Wuhan lab, is he gave another one of these grifters, a guy called the other Peter Hotez, right? He gave him a huge check. Fauci gave Hotez a huge check in 2016 in order to mitigate against lab leak of lab-created viruses. It says that. I'm not making it up. So Fauci is perfectly aware in 2016 of the possibility of lab leak of lab-manipulated viruses. Hence, he gives I don't know how I don't think Hotez ever came up with anything, and it was probably just a giant grift. But at least they used the grift as an excuse to dole out money to this Hotez guy to mitigate against a lab-made virus. So what? And then when it happened, Fauci claimed, no, it can't be. It has to be natural.
Yeah, and that same kind of hypocritical stance applies through all the researchers. It was Christian Anderson that was laughing at these guys trying to do this kind of, predictive work to prevent anything from outbreak. But here's Fauci giving funding to prevent a lab leak. Here's Hotez receiving the grant to prevent a lab leak. These are the same people who, once a lab leak actually happens, publicly are out there, first of all, stating it couldn't have been a lab leak, but also playing down the risk from a lab leak, as if it was exceedingly rare when lab leaks are unfortunately exceedingly common. And it's so transparent if you could see the larger picture, but most of the people had no idea who these people are. And so the first thing they know about Peter Hotez is he's, just somebody who's disputing the fact that it ever could have happened, despite the fact that he got a project to work on exactly that problem.
I know.
Peter Hotez, oh God, he's
beyond frustrating. One. And the guy, CNN always has him on, and whoever has him on all the time. No one has ever in the media, in the fake media, fake news, they have never, ever said what we've just explained in terms of Hotez taking the money to prevent lab leaks, supposedly. I think we then, on the timeline, we move into 2018 because this is so, everything fits. I mean, once you lay out the timeline as we're doing here, everything falls into place, because then the same three people who were on the 2015 paper, the one that caused all these big warnings about a man-made pandemic, they get together and they create the blueprint for making COVID. And that's the diffuse blueprint, which you already mentioned earlier. So the same people being Daszak, Xi Jinping, and Ralph Baric. It's incredible. The same gang gets together in 2018 and tries to get this done. Now, I think we've talked about this before on the show, so I'm not going to rehash everything, but the short of it is that they didn't get the funding on the US side because it was just so reckless. I mean, they literally proposed making a COVID-like virus. But because Xi Jinping was on the project, she had the blueprint. She had all the materials. She had all the drafts. She had all the lab set up, all the instructions, everything that the US side had, she had. So of course the Chinese went ahead. I mean, it's just obvious that they went ahead.
And also based on the blueprint itself, it felt like the work had already begun anyway.
Right, yeah.
And once again, what is Daszak doing? Daszak is being manipulative and deceptive and, pretending that the work's going to be done at Barrick's lab when the plan was always to do it at the Wuhan lab, downplaying Xi Jinping's, involvement in the project when in fact she was going to be almost primary. So it's this ongoing pattern. And like you said, it's the same people. Maybe one note of kudo, though, is there's another person who keeps cropping up, but on the opposite side of it and deserves a lot of credit. And that's Richard Ebright.
Yeah.
Because he has been a critic of this from day one. He was the guy when the 2015 paper was made public, immediately jumped into the fray. The only thing these people are doing is creating an unnecessary risk that was not present before. And he's been an ongoing critic of this. He's done a great job in trying to expose all of this. And for that, he's been attacked by these same people who've been trying to discredit him and trying to get him fired. So.
No, that's exactly right. So then we move into 2019. They created, by they, I mean the Chinese side create, and we of course we don't know like who exactly, was it Xi Jinping personally, was it her lab assistant Ben Hu, was it, I think it was Zhao Yuzhen, the PLA guy at her lab, but they created COVID in 2019 based on the blueprint. And we know that because the blueprint describes this furin cleavage site insertion, and that's never, ever, ever been seen in nature. So again, for those who have not followed this closely, there was a 2018 blueprint involving those 3 people to create something that looks exactly like COVID. And a year later, something exactly like COVID, well, COVID shows up right at the doorsteps of that lab. So
I
I
just want to interject real quick, because there was one other thing that happened. Well, there's a lot of other things, but there was another notable thing is, don't forget, is that the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing visited the Wuhan lab and were, I think, pretty shocked at what they found. So much so that they made a series of visits, and they sent a series of cables back to NIH, to the Defense Department, saying, hey, like, they've got serious safety problems here.
And then the lab prevented Fauci's representative, Chen Ping, from even visiting. And then when she was finally allowed to visit, they forbade her from taking any photos. So they knew they had problems, and they didn't want to kind of alert anyone or like allow anyone to expose those problems. So warning after warning after warning after warning. Okay, and then it happened, and then it leaked. And what did Daszak do? Well, we already talked about his tweet thread, like his CYA thread, and his email to Fauci's office, his CYA email, and the Lancet letter. He did a lot of things. But there's one thing he did not do, and this goes straight to huge culpability and all those things. When COVID emerged, he did not say, oh, yeah, guys, by the way, we had this 2018 blueprint for making COVID, and here, just wanted to let you know, it might be important, He didn't say anything. Xi Jinping, well, obviously she didn't say anything, but Ralph Barrick didn't say anything either. That to me, in many ways, I mean, there's so much blame, and there's so much nefariousness, and there's so much evilness, to be honest, across the board in this entire saga and this entire story. And again, we're not just talking 2020 onwards. As we just talked about, it goes back. But in many ways, to me, maybe the worst thing of all is these guys not coming clean about this diffuse proposal, this blueprint for making COVID in a lab. That had to be, we had to wait for another few years for a whistleblower to release that. That, to me, that's probably the worst offense of all.
Yeah, and as much as that's the worst offense, you might think, well, the people that were most closely involved are the ones that are most likely to lie out of fear. And indeed they did. But they weren't the only ones that knew about the diffuse proposal. We knew that there were certain elements within DARPA which were fully aware of this because they were the ones that negged the proposal. They never spoke out. But then we found out that it wasn't just a very closely held group of people. There was something like representatives from like 15 different agencies within the government that were part of this, that were there at presentations. So there was a much wider group of people that knew about it, and nobody spoke up. So not only the people that are most closely affiliated and most culpable, and therefore most likely to lie, but also the other surrounding group. Everybody stayed quiet, and as they watched the natural, origin get fomented, everybody had to see this as a cover-up. And even as they watched that build up, nobody said anything.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So anyway, this was a long time coming. It's happened. The guy's been defunded. His organization's been defunded. Again, this has already happened. There is a process to make it permanent, but the suspension is already in place. Again, these are the Biden people. This is Biden's HHS. This has nothing to do with Republicans. And probably scapegoating him. It probably won't work because, as we said, there's going to be he's going to throw them under the bus as well. Daszak is, by releasing other things, or at least it's going to get very, very messy. And I can't wait for all those things to happen.
Yeah.
But to me, again, the biggest takeaway is that, well, it is a fall guy kind of situation here. But as much as people are celebrating that finally it's happened, there's no excuse for it not to have happened years and years and years ago. And one thing we didn't even mention is right when things got very, very bad with the gain of function on one of the grants that Daszak was getting from Fauci. This was a 5-year grant between 2014 and 2019. And right towards the end, where they were creating these viruses that were 10,000 times more infectious than the original versions, Daszak didn't submit the reports. Oh, we had a IT problem. never submitted the report. That was done much, much later, like way into, like, was it 2022 or something? They
Well, and
then
that
sort
was
of
a very
the
public
report.
fight over even that information. But yeah, they just let him get away with the delay until publicly he was unable to.
And then, we had statements from various. I've never had a NIAID grant, but I've had grants, not NIAID, but other government funding agencies. I can attest personally, and we have had statements from people who had lots of NIAID grants, and everyone confirms and attests that it is simply impossible. And we all know how these bureaucracies work. You cannot not give your report and then still get funded, like you still get your millions. It just doesn't happen
Let alone for years.
for years and years. That's right. You just can't do it. It's like, oh, computer problems, doesn't matter. Submit, or we're going to pause your money. And for some reason, that rule did not apply to Daszak. Look, that's just one, but it's 10, 20, 30 times where warnings and red flags and whatever were just ignored. Because again, the report was not submitted in 2019. This is before COVID. So again, if it had been submitted, and if we'd seen what happened with the 10,000 times increase and so on, maybe someone could have put a stop to it. It's one of these. It's like an air crash where there are 100 different. If 100 things had to go wrong for this air crash to have happened, if only one of them had not happened, it would not have happened. And it's sort of the situation here, only that it's not accidental. Much of it is just down to pure and total recklessness, or perhaps even beyond recklessness. But so many things, so many warnings were overlooked or just ignored, or willfully just put aside or whatever. And I think that I wish that story would kind of come out more, especially now that everyone's celebrating that. Well, not everyone, but everyone who's been thinking about this stuff honestly, that finally Daszak is defunded. Okay, great celebration, whatever. But let's not lose sight of the fact that the real story is that this could have been prevented at any juncture. As we went back to 2011. And there were so many spots along the way where this could have been prevented.
I mean, I guess, a couple thoughts. One, just the fact they were doing the work in a BSL-2 lab. It staggers the mind that happened. But there's also, I think it's important not to ignore the fact that there's a sense of inevitability here. That, you mentioned all these different points, and that is extremely accurate. But they were all guided around not stopping anything, and just the law of numbers in terms of lab leaks, etc. It was inevitable at some point in time that a virus would leak if the work was allowed to continue. Just, period, end of sentence. And everybody was so willing to look the other way and to allow this continue for their own reasons. And that brings me, I guess, to kind of my final point, is that, both of us think that Daszak is going to probably go after people. I'm almost certain that he is. And yeah, I'm here for that show. But, and this is a huge but, there are so many other people that are culpable in the cover-up of this, that knew what was transpiring, that stayed quiet, that knew it was a massive cover-up, that didn't say anything, the people that enacted the cover-up. I mean, this should be the biggest scandal, and that my biggest fear is that this is going to end into an entertaining but contained backstabbing fight between Fauci and Daszak and maybe Collins, and not actually break out into the larger exposure of what this really is. That it was government funded, that everybody knew about it. I can't say everybody, but it was widely known. And I'm worried that everybody is, as they always do, are going to walk away unscathed in this. And there'll be a few fall guy people. I mean, Fauci's what, 83, I'm guessing now at this point? Something like that. I mean, probably nobody cares about Fauci other than to the extent that he can hurt them. Same thing for Daszak. But yet they carry culpability in this as well.
I completely agree with you. And if the system and the machine is left to its own devices, that's its resolution of it. Daszak is the fall guy. Everyone else moves on. That's the planning here.
I mean, Jeremy Farrar from the Wellcome Trust in the UK was the one that organized the responsive conference call, What was one of their first actions from that conference call? To reach out to Tedros at the World Health Organization, shut down Zero Hedge, who was doing very early, questioning whether it came from a lab leak. I mean, there's so many people. It's just so infuriating.
It is, and they made him Jeremy Farrar. They made him the head of the World Health Organization, chief scientist, or I think that's his title. I mean, so he was actually rewarded for his complicity in all of this. Look, I completely agree with you. If the system is left to its own devices, it will just. Daszak is your fall guy. He did bad things. If only we had known. Anyway, let's all move on now.
And maybe Fauci.
Well, I think it's going to continue coming down to people like us. Literally, there aren't many. I mean, I don't want to toot by my own horn here, but let's face it. How many people actually talked about this stuff early and consistently and were proven 100% right? 10? No more than 10. I mean, worldwide. Just go on Twitter, go on. Publishing papers, articles, whatever. There were some really fantastic ones in terms of the science, like Rosanna Sagreto, Yuri Dagan. There's some people in the Drastic group. There are people like you and I on the sort of getting the message out there. U.S. Right to Know, and that's almost it. Okay, so I think it will. It's not over. Our role will continue, and I always say, we're kind of journalists pro tempore. I didn't choose this or whatever. It's just kind of where we ended up because of circumstances, because no one else will do this. And what I think what will have to be done is when Daszak lashes out, someone's going to have to analyze that. The media's not going to analyze that. He's the fall guy, fine. Everyone moves on, sort of thing. The government won't do anything about it. It will be down to people like us to figure out what is Daszak trying to do here. What do all these emails? Let's assume he's going to just dump a bunch of emails or whatever. What's in those? There's going to be transcripts that are released. So the government just released, or the House just released the Francis Collins transcript. Hundreds of pages. Is anyone going to read that? By the way, Francis Collins, Fauci's boss, washing his hands. No, we didn't know. We had nothing to do with it. Sorry. NIH now admits that they did do gain of function in Wuhan. Lawrence Tabak, acting head, just admitted it. So all of that points in one direction, which is Daszak, fall guy. So again, I think our role, not our chosen role, but just the way it's going to be, because it has been for the past 4 years, is to keep digging into anything and everything that comes out and putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
I think we even saw like a hint of that. Obviously there's an incentive not to broadly expose things. And we saw that today with the release. We saw that with the House released the transcript of Francis Collins. Yep. And they provided their key takeaways in that. And when I read the key takeaways, I fell out of my chair. They were an absolute joke. They weren't looking at any of they treated him as if he was sort of an ancillary, he may have known about a few things. Here was a guy, he literally directed censorship of the people that were trying to push back. He was intricately involved. He was involved in the editing of Proximal Origin. And they treated him like he was some sort of unaffiliated guy who might have known a little and should have said something. Infuriating.
Well, as I said, it's going to come down to a few of us on Twitter and kind of in that what you like to call the corner. You used to call it the corner for Russiagate. Well, now we have our COVID gate corner. So I think it's not just because Daszak has been defunded, it doesn't mean it's over. In fact, it's just started, because the narrative is going to be that he's the fall guy, and we know we know that he is the fall guy, but we know that that's not he's not factually responsible for everything. He's like maybe 10% responsible or 5% or whatever you want to apportion. And there's a whole bunch of other people, including Francis Collins, very much so. By the way, Francis Collins, in my view, is far more culpable than Peter Daszak.
Yep, I agree with that. I mean, he was directing things.
That's exactly right. He was the head of the funding agency that empowered the Wuhan lab. So. And he was directing the cover-up once it went wrong. as you say, he censored people. He censored the Great Barrington Declaration. He was out there actively abusing his position as head of NIH to shut up American citizens. It's just completely unreal. And yet all of that happened. And as you say, now the GOP is kind of treating this guy with not only with kid gloves. I think you're right. It's beyond that. Like this poor old grandfather didn't really know what was going on.
He knew. He knew everything. He was intimately involved from day one. He knew everything that Fauci was doing. If anything, those two were close confidants.
Right, exactly. But anyway, I think the ultimate, maybe to kind of end on this, the ultimate person who is ultimately responsible is Fauci. He was the godfather. Starting in 2011, a risk worth taking, these experiments, that's Fauci. All the way through the cover-up, all the way through now, it's all Fauci.